Harvey, we're in business. What's
Okay,
today's
this
date?
evening is May 16th, 2022, corresponding to Tet Zion ER 5782.
Okay, thank you. Tonight's topic is Pruzbal. It's timely because Pruzbal has to be written by the end of the Shemitah year. We're in the middle of Shemitah year. Shemitah year starts Rosh Hashanah, ends Rosh Hashanah. So if you don't sign a Pruzbal before the beginning of Rosh Hashanah this year, if you people owe you $1 million, you won't be able to collect it. So it's a good idea, but even if they don't owe you $1 million. So the this year, I want to show you something that fascinates me, and that is the different style of psak between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. I mean, I'm not a big enough bucky to be able to make definitive statements, but there's something we'll see. I think it's clear that there's certain basic differences in the approach of the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, and it reflects itself in the discussion about Pruzbal. We'll see that the Shulchan Aruch says you must write a Pruzbal, and the Ramah says you don't have. He says many of the poskim say you don't have to write a Pruzbal, and it's interesting that they diverge on that, and the Shulchan Aruch doesn't quote those opinions, and the Ramah does. Okay, but I'm jumping ahead, so I'm just giving you an idea where I'm headed. So let's start. The basis for Shemitah is Psukim in Parshas Re'eh. This I took from one of the Sfarim on Shemitah. In Parshas Re'eh, the Psukim are Miket Sheva Shanim Tasa Shemitah. You make a Shemitah at the end of 7 years. V'zeh Dvar Shemitah. Here's what happens on Shemitah. Shamot Kol Baal Mashiyado. You should let go of any debts that you're trying to collect. Lo Yigos Es Re'ehu. And you should not put pressure on your friend. So those are two separate mitzvahs that are associated with the. This is Rabbi Rimon Sefer. There are two separate mitzvahs that are associated with Shemitah. One is the mitzvah Saseh, Shmot Kol Baal Mashiyado. You're supposed to say that Shamot Ani, that somebody comes and wants to pay you a loan during Shemitah. You have to say I'm Shamot. I don't even want you to pay. We'll discuss. Does that mean that you're Michael the loan, or is the loan canceled without your? Do you have to do a ma'aseh to cancel it, or is it canceled automatically? We'll see. Then next week we'll talk about that. And then the second mitzvah is there's a losa say to go and pressure somebody to pay you a loan that was canceled by Shemitah. And then there's a third pasuk that says Shemitah. You don't be stingy. When somebody comes to you for a loan, don't tell them, you're at risk. There's 3 years to the Shemitah, and the likelihood of your paying me back is 10%. So it's a bad, not a good idea. You're not allowed to do that. Yeah, you have to lend people money, and there's a mitzvah to lend people money. It's not an optional thing. It's a mitzvah to say, and even in face of the fact that there's going to be a cancellation of debts, there's still a mitzvah to lend people money. I once said, this is an aside, it says, no, this is the wrong, in the next pasuk, it says, Nasan titan lo, lo yeru lebachu b'sita lo. No, that's not the pasuk I'm looking for. Okay, we'll leave this for a different time. I'm looking for a different pasuk, it's not here. So, so it's very straightforward that there's a mitzvah of Shemitah. Then the Gemara says that there's a din of Pruzbal. Why Pruzbal allows you to lend money and it doesn't get canceled. So you would think that that's like first how could you operate against what it says in the Torah, and why would Chachamim create a method to get around what the Torah wanted? The Torah wanted that the loans should be canceled. Why did Chachamim institute their own way of dealing with that? So the Gemara on page 2, the Gemara says Hillel Hiskin Pruzbal. That's in the Mishnah. I didn't quote the Mishnah, but the Mishnah says in Gittin, in Parak HaShaleach, that Hillel instituted Pruzbal. So the Gemara explains, why did Hillel institute Pruzbal? Not Hasam. Pruzbal Eino Mishamit. If you have a pruzbal, then the loans are not canceled. This is one of the things that Hill Hazakin, there was more than one Hill. This was the original Hill that he instituted. So why did Hill institute this? The people stopped lending money. Even though there was a law to say that you're not allowed to withhold loans, but people Hishamach is the law to say, but people didn't want to do it anyway. There was a lot of money, and they weren't willing to risk it. What Torah says you should do it, that that's human nature. So in the meantime, the poor people were suffering. So and the rich people were violating the lav. So Ahmad Hiskim Pruzbal. So he'll institute a pruzbal. Is that gufu shel pruzbal? Mosrani lechem ploni ploni dayanim shemakom ploni. The essence of pruzbal is that you go to a bezdin and you say that I'm transferring to you and you who are the dayanim shemakom ploni shechol chov sheyesh yetz ploni sheagvenu kozman she'ertza. Any loan that I have, I should be able to collect whenever I want. V'dayanim chosmu lamata o edim, and either the dayanim or the edim sign at the bottom of the pruzbal. That's on the bottom of page 1. I have a this is a boilerplate pruzbal. There's other pruzbals that have fancier language, but basically, the most of we were sitting with 3 people together, and so Harav, so and so Chaim ben Shimon came to us. Any loan that I have, I could collect at any time, even after Shemitah. What does Beis Aleph Ayin Hey Ches stand for? It says it right away next to it. We signed on this, and you put in the date, and you put in the Dayanim have to sign. And that's what we're basically going to do. If you remember from last time and the time before, Sunday morning, I'll be available in my office for probably after the 3 minyanim, like Mechiras Chametz, and I'll ask 2 people to join me, and as people come in, they'll have to make that statement, and then we fill in the blanks, and then the Eidim sign, and that's the pruzbal. How does pruzbal work? So there's some shayla, but in the nusach of the pruzbal, it says I'm transferring the loan to the bezdin. So the pshat is that the isser of yigos doesn't apply to a bezdin; it only applies to a private individual. But there's no shmita on a bezdin. There's a lot of shaylos. Let's say a gemach. Does a gemach have to write a pruzbal? Maybe a gemach is like a bezdin. It's not a person. So there's a lot of discussion about these kind of things. But the basic idea is that the pruzbal, but shmita doesn't apply to a bezdin. So the Gemara says, "Umi kamidi deraisa mishamta." Again on page 2, mishamta shvi is vehiskin hill the lo mishamta. How could Hill make a takana that shvi should not be mishamit? So you see from the Gemara that even though he's transferring the loan to the bezdin, midaraisa the Gemara held that would not prevent the Shemitah from canceling the loan. It's a rabbinic institution, but the Gemara is asking how could Rabbanan be misaki in something that doesn't work on the level of the Raisa? It's Geneva, or it's not Geneva, but the person owes money. The Torah says you owe him money. The Torah says you don't owe him money. And then he writes pruzbal, now you're going to force him to pay money. So you're forcing him to pay money that he doesn't really owe. So Mar says, Amar Rabbi b'shvius b'zman hazeh. We're talking about b'zman hazeh, Rebbe, and it follows the opinion of Rebbe. B'zman hazeh means it's in Bayis Sheni. The Tanya Rebbe Omer Zed Dvar Shmita Shamot. The Torah says Zed Dvar Hashmita Shamot. This is the thing of Shmita. It's mishamet. It cancels the loan. So it puts the word shamot is repeated. Hashmita shamot. So the Gemara darshans b'shnei shmitas akasam medaber. It's an allusion to 2 shmitas. Acha shmitas karka v'acha shmitas ksafim. There's a shmita for land that you can't grow, you can't harvest during Shemitah, vegetables and fruit, and there's a Shemitah when it comes to money. Bisman she'ata mishamet karka, ta mishamet ksafim. Bisman she'ata mishamet karka, i'ata mishamet ksafim. The only time there's a din of Shemitah on loans is when there's a din of Shemitah on karka. When there's no Shemitah on karka, there's no Shemitah on loans. Why is there no Shemitah on karka nowadays? So Tosfos explains, he quotes Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says there's another hekesh between Shemitah and Yovel. And the Yerushalmi says that when there's no Yovel, you don't observe Shemitah. And there's no Yovel because the only time there's Yovel is when the Rov, it has to be Rov HaTzibur, Kol Yoshvel, has to be majority Klal, so it has to be in Eretz Yisrael. So the even though the people came back by Sheni, but not enough to be the majority, there were still people in Bavel, or I guess in Bavel. So therefore, there was no Yovel in Bayis Sheni. Once there's no Yovel, so there's no Shemitah of Karka, because those two are linked together. There's Shemitah of the Karka and the Yovel. Yovel, is the 50th year, and they make an announcement that the slaves go free and the properties return to their owners, and Yovel also has an element of Shemitah. It's a double Shemitah. The 49th, 50th year, you're not allowed to work the land. So the Gemara says that there's a connection between Shemitah and Shemitah's karka and Shemitah's ksafim, because the pasuk says shamot hashmita shamot. So when there's no Shemitah's karka, there's no Shemitah's ksafim, and the reason why there's no Shemitah's karka doesn't say in the Gemara, but Tosfos quotes Yerushalmi, because there's a link between Yovel and Shemitah's karka. Since there's no Yovel, once the majority of Jewish people don't live in Eretz Yisrael, there's no Yovel, there's no Shemitah. So if there's no Shemitah's ksafim nowadays, so what do you need Pruzbul for? The Shemitah doesn't operate anymore. And how come people give Trumas and Maisus nowadays? If there's no mitzvah, if there's no, not okay. They take the back. But how come in Eretz Yisrael they observe Shemitah nowadays? Why should they observe it? There's no Yovel. There should be no Shemitah. So Mar says Utkinu, and the next paragraph, Utkinu Rabbanan the Tishamed Zechu Shvius. The Chazal made a takana that you should observe Shemitah, even though midiraisa there's no din of Shemitah, because since there's no Yovel, there's no Shemitah. But midrabanan they said that they were misakein, that you should observe it. Rashi says shelo tishkachach kar shvit. Otherwise, people won't even remember there's such an institution. So therefore, midrabanan there's a chiyuv of Shemitah. So if there's a chiyuv of Shemitah midrabanan, then there's also a Shemitah's ksafim, because the two are together. So just like on the deraisa level, there's only Shemitah's ksafim when there's Shemitah's karka. And the same thing's on the Darbanan. If there's a mitzvah Darbanan of Shemitah's karka, so then there's a mitzvah Darbanan of Shemitah of Yovel. So Shemitah's ksafim is the Darbanan. So now, our question before is, how could Hillel make a takana that goes against the Torah? So the Gemara says, Ra Hillel shenin amni l'halva says, amad ve'hiskim pruzbol. So he made pruzbol because since midaraisa, there is no Shemitah doesn't function anymore. It's only din d'Rabbanan. So the Rabbanan they can make their own takana. So he made a takana that there should be a din of Chazal midrabanan were misakin this din of Shemitah's ksafim, and Hillel, in order to prevent the wealthy from not loaning money, so he instituted pruzbol so that the loan would be secure, even though midrabanan the loan should be canceled, but midrabanan pruzbol counteracts Shemitah. That's what it says here in the Gemara. So it looks very straightforward that there's a din of Shemitah bisman hazeh. It's Shemitah's ksafim bisman hazeh is the Rabbanan, and then there's also a din of pruzbol. So it seems to be like a no-brainer that's going to be the halacha. If you look on page 5, the Shulchan Aruch says towards the bottom of the page where I have the bar, the Shulchan Aruch says, Ein Shmitas Ksafim no Heges Meditara Elbisman Shayovanog. There's Midaraisa, there's no Shmitas Ksafim, because there's no Yovel. Umidivrei Sofrim Shitahei Shmitas Ksafim no Heges Meditara Elbisman. But Midrabanan, there is Shmita. Shmita operates Midrabanan, and therefore, since it operates Midrabanan, so he's going to go on in the next few Sifim and explain that you could write a prosbol in order to counteract the din deraisa. And the Ramah says, Hagoah Kenu Askama Saposim. That's what many of the poskim say, that there's a din of Shemitah Bisman Hazeh Midrabanan. Aval Yesh Omrim, the Ein Shemitah, the Heges Bisman Hazeh. But there are those, that hold there's no Shemitah Bisman Hazeh. V'nira Shaleim Samchu B'din Yisrael Shein Nogim Din Shemitah Klal Bisman Hazeh. And that's what people rely on, that they don't observe Shemitah anymore, and therefore they don't write prosbol, because if no Shemitah, you don't need a prosbol, because the Shemitah is canceled. So where in the world does that come from? Why does the Ramah say that there are poskim that say there's no prosbol, there's no Shemitah Bisman Hazeh? Shemitah meaning Shmitas Ksafim. So first on page 3. First, I'll show you on page 3. The Rambam says clearly that Shemitah is no Bismana. The same Mechaber's psak that there is Shemitah midrabanan. That's the Rambam shita, because the Rambam says where I have it underlined in the second paragraph here that umidirei sofrim shetahei Shemitah ksafim nohegas b'zman hazeh b'chol makom. The Rambam before that said, you know what? I didn't underline it, but if you look at the top of the page on Sif Beis, it says Ein Shmitas Ksafim Noheges Min, and then you go to the next paragraph. Torah Elbas Masha Yovanogi Sheyesh Shmitas Karkam. The Ram says that there's that link. That Yovel, if there's no Yovel, there's no Shemitah. But it's Midrabanan. They instituted Midiri Sofrim. He says in Sif Gimel Shetahei Shmitas Ksafim Noheges B'zman Hazeh B'chol Makom. That's exactly what the Gemara says, that they instituted Shemitah in order that the institution of Shemitah should not be forgotten, and therefore there's a din of Shemitah midrabanan, and therefore it makes sense that there should be prosbol in order to protect against the cancellation of the loan. Okay, fine. So now where did the Ramah get this, that there are those that say that there's no din of Shemitah Bisman Hazeh? So one place he got it was from the Ravid. The Ravid at the bottom of the page here, the Ravid says, Re'isi Shekosav Harab Zal. This Ravid is printed on the bottom of the Rif. I don't think this Ravid is the same as maybe it is the same as the Ravid in the Ram. I don't remember. Anybody know if it's the same? What? It is the same Ravid. Okay, there's more than one Ravid. So he says, Re'isi Shekosav Harab Zal. When he calls the Rav Zal, he's referring to the Rif. The Rif says Minayin Prusbol. The Rif discusses Prusbol, the Hasugya Kula, and he quotes the whole sugya about Prusbol. V'lo yadati imusover shenog shmitas ksafim bisman hazeh. I'm not sure. Does the Rif hold that midrabanan is a din of shmitas ksafim, like the Rambam? Or maybe there are midrabaisa and midrabanan. There's no din of shmita, but it's a midas chasidus that you should cancel the loans. And he shows that some of the Amoraim held that you should cancel the loans. It's a midas chasidus, so he's not sure. So that's the first inkling that something's amiss here. That not everybody agrees. Even though the Gemara says that the Gemara says beferish that there is a din of shmitas ksafim midrabanan shalotish takach taras shmita. So how does the Ravid? How could the Ravid have such a position? It's connected to the Gemara. It's black and white in the Gemara. So we're going to see there's a number of different theories why. You know, before we go further, let me show you the rush. That's the best thing I should show you next. The rush is on... Where did I put the rush? The rush is on page 1. Ah, you're right. On page 1. He knows my sheets better than me. The rush says... On page 1. Okay. The Rush says, the Rush is printed in the back of the Gemara. There's the Piskei Rush, where the Rush paskins halachos. He extracts from the Gemara the halacha ma'isa, but then the Rush also wrote shalos teshuvos. So the Rush says, "Val dvar hashmita shamati es yad shamatati es yad melichta bin shmita miyom ba l'aretz hazos." From the time that I came to this land, I did not write about shmita. The Rush was born in Germany. He lived in Cologne, and he was a Talmud of the Maram Rittenberg, and then as the Jews throughout the Middle Ages were constantly being persecuted and attacked and thrown into jail, just like the Maram Rittenberg was. Maram Rittenberg, he wasted away in jail for 12 years, whatever.
That's why the Rosh left, because
once his Rebbe died, he left, and he was next, right? And because they asked for a huge sum of money to ransom the Marami Rutenberg, and the Rush said the Marami Rutenberg said they shouldn't ransom him because then it encourages more kidnappings.
But they ransomed his body in the end.
What?
I think they did.
They did pay for a rich Gvir paid for his body to be removed from the prison and buried. So. I mean, that was the rishus of the goyim. They took an innocent person, they put him in jail and they tried to extort exorbitant amounts of money from the Jewish community. So the Rush ran away from Germany and he went to Spain. And first he was a Rav in Barcelona, and then he ended up in Toledo, in Spain. So the Rush says that when I came to this L'Aretz Hazos, he's talking about Spain. When I came to Spain, I didn't want to write about Shemitah. Ki dvarim rabim hayuli im gedoli ha'ir madua eino mashmitim kesafim. He said when he came to Spain, he had a strong disagreement with the Gedolim in the city. I don't know if he's talking about Barcelona or Toledo, but he had strong disagreement because they said that Shemitah it doesn't operate. There's no more Shemitah's Ksafim, and you don't need Pruzbal. And they said, the Rabbanim in Spain said that that's the minig. The minig in Spain is that they don't observe Shemitah. The Efshel Levatel HaMinig Shenago Zeh Yamim Rabim. And you can't be Mevatel such a minig. Kiharva Malvos Yeshanos Yesh B'aretz Hazos. There are many old loans that are still outstanding in Spain, and they're all outstanding. They didn't write Pruzbols. They didn't bother writing Pruzbols because they felt that whatever reason, which we're going to discuss, they didn't believe that there's Shemitah anymore. So if there's no more Shemitah, you don't have to write a Pruzbol. So he says if you're going to go ahead now and reverse that, you're going to throw all the financial affairs into a tremendous state of turmoil. And they were probably wealthy people. It wasn't just like for $10. They were very wealthy people, and you're going to disrupt the whole economy. And they brought me a raya to their position because of the way the shtar was written. He's talking about the shtar halva. He says the shtar halva was written in a way that Shemitah would not operate. V'lo nisyashli taimim, and I didn't agree with their explanation. Umatzasi isnatzus atmi ayadei shmitas yadei atmi she'eno mis. He said, when I found a excuse for myself by withdraw instead of using the word shmita for himself. He says I practiced shmitas yadi. I just withdrew myself. She'eni mis'oro v'atam in hagam. I didn't write a tshuva saying that what you're doing is wrong. V'omer ani the efsher kaven the shapashar aminek shalol hashmid akol yodim havli ki'ilas na'amav amanash shalol tishmiteni shviyas. And he says maybe what they hold is that since everybody knows that Shemitah, the minig was that the Shemitah doesn't operate, so maybe it's like they wrote into the shtar, Amanash Lo Tishmiteni Shviyas. The Gemara Makkos discusses whether it's Masa Masha Kosa Torah, but if you say, I'm lending you the money with the understanding that Shemitah won't be operative. So he says that that's maybe what they held, even they didn't even write it in the shtar. But since it was well known, so but what he did was he decided he's not going to say no, but he's not going to say yes. He's not going to paskin. He's not going to tell the people what they're doing is wrong, but he's not going to. But he's not going to support it. He's going to be passive.
Neuberger yesterday was giving shir on the first sugya in Bava Basra about building a wall and dina and privacy, and he was talking about the sugya of you said there's a machlokas Rashba and Truma Sedeshin. What's the makor that a minhag what's the power of a minhag in Mekach Memkar? So the Rashba says it's basically a das, and that this overwhelming das kind of creates a tnai in the Mekach Memkar. That when there's a minhag,
Since
when
it's
you agree to
understood,
business,
so it's an understood tnai.
So I asked Neuberger what happens when the understood tnai goes against what the Torah's understood. So could you say that stam, the das of the minhag, makes it into like a masna mashkas of a Torah, that when you agree to a business deal in this place, you're assuming that this deal is going against the Torah. You said no. He said besides her Moshe's tshuva by Yerushas Habanos, which is a chiddush gadol that only Moshe could say. Mistama, you can't say that.
Okay, you can't be masna mashkas of Torah.
That you can't
say that there's an umdana that's what the person meant. The more Rishonim say that when that normally dvar shavlei will have dvarim. If a person sells a piece of property and he says I'm an ass on the tonight that I'm gonna make aliyah. If I don't make aliyah, I don't want to sell my house. So such a tonight is valid. But let's say he doesn't say anything. So even though afterwards he comes back and he says, I only sold it because I thought I was making aliyah, and now that I'm not, so I in my head I had a tnai. So the Gemara says it doesn't help what you had in your head, because it's dvar shabalev ain't dvarim. But Tosa says that if it's an umda the muchach, if the circumstances make it clear that that's why he's selling it, and that he would not have sold it otherwise, then even though dvar shabalev will have dvarim, but if it's believable, if everybody knows what he's thinking, then dvar shabalev have dvarim. So that's what you're saying, that if there's a minhag, the minhag establishes what people have in their minds. But then you get into the issue of masla mashikos v'tara.
So when we said that even according to this Rashba, that we would assume in halacha that you can't assume that the dvarim shablev go against the Torah. You can't assume that a person.
Okay, I hear. Okay.
So how would that?
I don't know. Well, it seems that the Gemara in the Makkah says that there's Gemara Makkah says that Amanash Otish Miteni Shvius is not called masla mashikos v'tara. The Gemara says is the beginning of Makkah and Daf Gimel. The Gemara says there's Almanas, I forgot the two Lashonos, but there's one Lashon is Masna Mashikos V'Torah, and one Lashon is not. And this is the Lashon that's not Masna Mashikos V'Torah. You look it up in Daf Gimel Amid Aleph.
Rabbi, the whole thing with Stavim is tied to Karka, but are they discussing whether or not Karka applies?
No, they're not discussing that.
So are they saying that?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Are they arguing that
Okay, it's a.
to Stavim now?
Well, that's a very good question. Let's see. It's going to depend on why this minhag that the Rosh says he didn't understand the minhag, and he would have put out a kol koreh that what you people are doing is wrong. But he didn't do it because the Chacham said, "What you're going to go make a whole tumult?" This is, he says, Yamim Rabim. There's many years that we're doing it this way, so there must be a halachic basis. So he didn't want to protest, but he didn't want to support it.
When did he write this? When he's protesting?
He wrote this when he came to Spain. He died in 1327, so he wrote it before he died. He for sure didn't write it after he died. What?
No, he's saying that the thing that he wrote, he's not gonna write it. But if he wrote it.
Oh, he said he's not publicizing. He says, "Oh, you mean why did he?" He said Shemati Yisyadi, and then he wrote it.
Right.
Why did he?
Unless
So
he's talking
first,
about Cologne.
this may have been. It could be that it was that his shuvas were published by after he passed away. Maybe this was in his notes. And they found it in his notes that he says, I'm not going to write about it. But
there are numerous times where he writes a tshuva to somebody saying, I don't think you should do this, and you shouldn't write about it. But he didn't, as the Rav of the Sunni, he didn't like, say Hefker, Beis and Hefker and all these loans are forgiven, either. And that's probably what he means by Nishmatis Yadi, right? In other words, he didn't impose the halacha that said.
He didn't publicly oppose it. He left it be, and he.
I'm sure that if asked his opinion.
No, but he does say Shamatis Yadi Milichtov. He says I withdrew my hand from writing.
But I think he
So-
probably meant like a sock in the city, like, you know.
Okay, maybe that's what he means. Okay, maybe right. Maybe he means a public statement.
This tshuva is to a cousin, I think, that he wrote.
Okay, all right, I hear him. Either way, the Rosh is baffled by the fact that they don't observe Shemitah, and because they don't observe Shemitah, they don't bother writing Pruzbol. But he says he didn't want to be in opposition to what they're doing in the city. So there are a number of different possible explanations for this minhag that they didn't observe Shemitah, and to explain how that does not conflict with the Gemara. So the first explanation is in the Ran. The Ran on page 3 says near the bottom of the page where I have the bar on the left side. V'yesh min hachacham mekim v'amr she'achshav ein shmitas ksafim loheges klal ve'ein anu tzrichim peruzbol. Some say there's no more shmitas ksafim, we don't need peruzbol. L'fisha omrim the kamik kerevi damer she'ein shmita loheges elas mashin yol noeg, because we paskin that there's no shmita when there's no yovel. The cave in the chazina and kuli tuva b'peruzbol mashma the shmita b'zman hazeh rabban, and since you see that they used to write Pruzbol, it's a raya that we hold that Shemitah Bisman says Rabbanan. The Deraisa Rabbanan, the Plikay, the Rebbe Gohi Mekilba. It's a machlok whether Shemitah is Deraisa Rabbanan. So if you write Pruzbol, it means you hold Shemitah as Rabbanan. So he says the Kavish Shemitah Tluya B'Yovel Dvar Torah. Since Shemitah and Yovel are linked together, Midaraisa Af Midareim Ein Hagas El Bisman Yovel no way. He says like this. He says, just like on a Deraisa level, there's a link between Shemitah and Yovel, so on a Derabanan level, there's also a link between Shemitah and Yovel. So he says, Uvimei Rabbi Seino Haya Bezin Kavu Beretz Yisrael Shaya Makdishim Yovel Haya Tokim Mishalchin Avadim Yisrael Choshu Baleim. In Eretz Yisrael, initially they had Batei Dinim in Eretz Yisrael, and they in Bayesheni, even though Midaraisa there was no Yovel, because they didn't have the rov, they didn't have Kol Yisrael, they didn't have the majority of Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, but Midrabanan, they practice Yovel anyway. So as long as they practice Yovel, so they also practice Shmitas Ksafim. And therefore Shmita on both Shmitas, the Shmita of Karka and the Shmita of Kesef was knowing. But nowadays they're not knowing any Yovel. He's saying it's a beautiful thought, but it's a very big chiddush. He's saying the same way there's a linkage on the Deraisa, there's a linkage in the Torah. I mean, you could argue and say, the Deraisa, the Torah makes a link, it's Xeris Akosov, that there's a linkage. What does it have to do with the Drabanans? But he's saying, no, they patterned the Drabanan after the Deraisa. So just like on the Drabanan, they're linked. So the same way, just like the Deraisa, they're linked, and the Drabanan are linked. So initially in Eretz Yisrael, even after they came back there, the Bayesheni, the din of Yovel was only Drabanan, because they didn't have the majority of the Jews. But nonetheless, since they had Batei Dinim, and it was feasible to enforce Yovel, so they observed Yovel. Once they observed Yovel, they observed Shemitah's Karka, and they also observed Shemitah's Ksafim. But nowadays, if there's no Batei Dinim in Eretz Yisrael, nobody has any authority. You can't take away anything from anybody. So since there's no more Yovel, so similarly, there's no Shemitah's Ksafim. That's the Ran's explanation. It's a very beautiful explanation.
The Ran quoting the Yesh Min HaChachamim.
Yeah, okay. He's explaining whether it's his. Okay, you're right. It's not. He's just explaining. He's just quoting what somebody else said. He doesn't tell us who they are.
The Ran just have said is if you don't have a base din, you don't even have to come on to the Yovel. If you don't have a base din that's functional, so why do you have to say there's no Yovel and then there's no Shemitah?
No, if you don't have a best, so what if there's no best? But
so
Shemitah
who's going to enforce the principle?
doesn't matter. But a person wants to do the right thing. For people that I don't want to be a Goslin. If my loan is absolved, so I'm not going to go collect it.
So Yovel still is the trigger.
Yeah, the people still are interested in doing what's right. So, but
You need a Bezdin to establish a yovel? Isn't it just automatic on the 50th year?
midaraisa it's automatic. But once it was bottled midaraisa because they didn't have Rov Yisrael Aleha, so now they only had it midrabanan because of Zeicher Lemikdash.
No, but you're saying that they had a Bezdin that established it.
They since there was still but they dinim they made it a takana to keep Yovel Kishot Ishtakach Taras Yovel.
Right.
But they only were able to make such a takana if there was this is a major Ibrik in Yiddish means like everything is turned upside down. When it came Yovel, people had to return properties, the slaves had to go free. So they only observed that when they only instituted to observe Yovel when there were Batei Dinim. When there was no Batei Dinim,
In order to enforce it, you're saying.
in order to enforce it. So if there was no Batei Dinim, they didn't bother because the whole purpose was Shalot Ishtakach, and people are not going to observe it anyway. So they didn't. So if there's no Yovel D'Rabbanan, there's no Shemitah D'Rabbanan either. So that's one explanation.
But he then says he rejects it.
Yes, he doesn't agree with it. In the end, he says he doesn't agree. That's what he says. You always like to read
I
ahead.
can't help it. You haven't barred
He says 3 lines from the bottom. Apple became Matzino Lo Rabbanim.
No, the end said no.
No.
4 lines.
What?
4 lines from the bottom. The end said nothing.
Oh, Bein Zenachon. Sherei Mehil Anase Shetikon Asedem Ados Kin Yudar Pidimian Shuvo Hayibar Etzel Bezdin. He says it's not true that there was a Bezdin in the beginning of Bayesheni. That this whole theory is based on the fact that there's 2 different kufas. There was a period where there were Batei Dinim and now there's not. He says there were never Batei Dinim in Bayesheni. So he rejects it. But okay, but it's a possible explanation. Then there's the explanation of then there's the Marik
Okay.
on page 4. The Marik is the author was Rav Yosef Kolon. You see, he lived in 1420 to 1480. He was in France and in Italy. So he's one of the sources that when the Ramah says that there are those who say that nowadays you don't need prusbol because there's no Shemitah's Ksafim, one of the sources is the Marik. So Marik says, nowadays we don't observe Shemitah. On the contrary, we collect loans even though there was no prusbol and it's a Shemitah year. Even though it's like a pliya, how could we do that? It's connected to the whole sugya of the Gemara. But you see that already there's such a minig in the time of the Rush. Okay, he just quotes the Rush, but that's the Rush that we just saw. The Rush says that he came to Toledo or he came to Spain and he found out that they weren't observing Shemitah. So he says this has been the minhag that people were like. But he doesn't offer an explanation. But in the bottom of the page, you have the Trumas Hadeshin, which is Rav Yisrael Isulin, and he says, Chov she'avro, the beginning of the Tshuva. Chov she'avro lo shmita yochel hamalva l'kofel l'rova v'arkol shenachim shifenu. If a person lent money and then the borrower doesn't want to pay back because he says it was a shmita, could you go to the secular courts to collect the money? Kevin shekosa b'shtar bein medini so bein medini nachim or ka'avro lo yigosh. Are you allowed to go to courts? Even though you're not supposed to go to a non-Jewish court, but when he got the money, he wrote that if I can't collect in a Jewish court, I'm going to collect it in a non-Jewish court. So he says, he quotes the position. He says, okay, let's just go read it straight. You're Alabi the cost of Reed, even though from the Re and Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, they clearly hold that the Shemitah is Marazel, but the older Rabbanim, didn't follow that. V'adar shamati shahaya echad toa in shmitas ksafim liftar malva hayinechsh kasem in atmim. It went so far as that somebody had said, "I don't have to pay you back because of shmita." They said, "Well, you're off your rocker. What? We don't observe shmita anymore. It's gone." So what's the reason? So on the next page, he says, on the top of the page, he says, "V'nir limtzuk sas tam." He says, I'll offer an explanation. He says, because Shemitah is only Rabbanan. I'm reading where it's underlined. Since it's only Rabbanan, they instituted Shemitah, but they only instituted places near Eretz Yisrael. And he says, because the Re says, the Re says that they observe in the surrounding areas of Eretz Yisrael, even though it was chutzlars, they observed Trumas and Maises midrabanan, but far away they didn't observe. So he says, so therefore, the same thing with Shemitah. They only observe Shemitah near Eretz Yisrael, not places that are further away. So he says, he says, but Shemitah is like Chala. It's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah that's totally in the karka. It's a mitzvah that's totally on the gavra. So it's not a chayvis karka. Chala is knowing bisman hazeh because the Trumas Maises is not knowing at least midaraisa because it's chayvis karka and because after the churban the kedusha the karka is batal, but taking Chala has nothing to do with the karka. So it's a mitzvah shebegufo. So he says so canceling Shemitah is also a mitzvah shebegufo. So he says in the bottom yesh lomer hovi skina Shemitah's ksafim with Shemitah's karka. Since there's a hekesh between Shemitah's ksafim and Shemitah's karka, v'shem Shemitah chadahu the tavera b'kedushas shvi tali, and it's the same print. It's the same. It's all based on Shemitah. B'zman hazel niskan el hazeichel shviyas dam yitel chavos karka michal. He says since the Torah made a linkage between Shemitah's Ksafim and Yovel, so even though the argument was Shemitah's Ksafim is not a mitzvah, it's not a Chavis Karka, it's a mitzvah B'gufo. So he says, yeah, but the Torah makes it links it to a Chavis Karka, and since it's the Torah connects it to a Chavis Karka, which is Yovel, so therefore once it's connected. So they limited the takana to places that are near Eretz Yisrael. That's what he says. Okay, so you can see that these explanations are rather they're like trying to come up with an explanation. There's one more explanation in the Aruch HaShulchan. I'm not going to read it inside, because I want to point something out. The Aruch HaShulchan says that here it says on page 6. Let's read it quickly. He says the ikra on the right side. If he's on the top of it, if he's in there on the side, tam nachal mashal nogu b'harbi mekamas gam v'meis shana mikodim shmitas ksafim. For hundreds of years they didn't know shmitas ksafim, and therefore they didn't write prusbos. He says, why is that? He says v'ikra takanas prusbol. We're further down. Who kedei ayikadesh you kigavoi. The whole idea of prusbol is by giving the stars to Bezin, it's as if the loan is already collected. That's when you had Dayanim that had authority. Even in the time of the Gemara, there was the head of the Gola. What do they call that? The Lexar or something. So and he appointed Dayanim. What?
The
Exilar. The monarchy in those countries authorized the head of the Jewish community to enforce laws. Nowadays we don't have any such authority. So there's no purpose of doing a prusbol, because you're giving it to the Yanim who are powerless. There's no purpose in writing a prusbol. He said another thing is that the Gemara is going to say, we're going to talk about next week, that you need to own property in order to have a prusbul. And nowadays we don't. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, they didn't own property. They weren't property owners. He says, "Aval achaka kashin ispas b'chol kantos aras v'nitchu ein ol karkois meilad ein amalich l'prusbul. Ve'im ninhag ata shmita ksaf mshita shel yitzel halvus v'yavar mashikosu b'Torah yishamu l'cha." So he says, okay, you can't write prusbul because you don't have batei dinim, but still the din of shmita should apply. So he says that now that shmita, now that prusbul doesn't work, so the rich people are not going to want to lend money. So he says, he's saying that they instituted midrabanan, that there's a din of shmita, but they wouldn't have instituted midrabanan a din of shmita if they knew that prusbul wouldn't work. Because by instituting a din of shmita, the rich people are going to be over and they won't lend money, and they're not lending money. So this is the raisa. So it would be better not to make shmita, so that they would lend money. So okay, again, this
sounded like Hillel added it later after they already established it, but they're saying they wouldn't have established.
no, he's saying Hillel added it at a time when prusbul was effective. So and that way the wealthy people would lend money. But nowadays, prusbul anyway won't work. Because it's impotent. The Dayanim are impotent. They can't collect anything.
What about Davar Shabbat? Meaning it's Xeris Chazal. Who's to come in?
Okay, that's very good, excellent. Rav Moshe talks about it in this tshuva. That's Rav Moshe makes that point that you could argue in the Aruch HaShulchan. Okay,
Doesn't Rav Moshe himself do that though? By clapping on Shabbos, Rav Moshe Paskins.
that we had a long shir about that. We talked about that for 3 shiur.
So
You
Rav
missed
Moshe-
it.
So Rav Moshe Paskins that against Davar Shabbat, that it's kind of.
Rav Moshe has a whole cheshbon why you don't apply davar shemin by clapping. Anyway, so let's look again in the Shulchan Aruch on page 5. Shulchan Aruch says, "Ein shmitas ksafim, no haggis meditar." The Mechaber says that there's no shmita midaraisa. Bismash no midiri so shetei shmitas ksafim no haggis mazeh manaseh v'chol midrabanan there is. And then he said, and the Ramah says that's the Rambam that I showed you the Rambam, and it's also the Ran, the B'Shem Yeshorim that I showed you that the Ran disagrees with the first explanation. He says, "Kenu Haskama suppose." That's what many posting hold. Aval Yeshorim and the Ein Shmita and the Haggis B'Zanazeh. There are many posting hold it's not noi. V'nira Shaleim Samchu B'Dinas El Shenogin Dim Shmita Kol B'Zanazeh. And that is, on that basis, the minig was in the countries where where he was living in Poland, in Krakow, the people don't write prusbuls. And this minig goes back to the time of the Rush. He says that the Rush was yelling, what's a kruchya? It's a type of bird. I forgot what it's called. But he was a bird that squawks very loud. So the Rush tried to make him achav, and they didn't listen to him. Ukvar kosu gamkein achron zal tam minig she'ein nogin shmita k'mavur b'dirim rik. And an explanation for why they're not knowing shmita, you have the marik that I showed you, umari listen, the Truma Sedeshin that I showed you, umariel. The ain l'da. Okay, so the Ramah seems inclined to say that there is no shmita b'zman hazeh, and you don't need prusbul. Because the Rush says it was such a minhag, even though the Rush was very upset about it, but he didn't protest. And you have the Marik and the Mariel and the Truma Sedeshin. Those three. Those are his. Besides the Rush, those are the 3 main supports that he has: the Marik, the Mariel, and the Truma Sedeshin. So what I want to offer an explanation here why the Mechaber ignored those other poskim. He ignored the Rush, and he also ignored the Mariel and the Marik, the Mariel and the Marik, the Mariel and the Marik and the Truma Sedeshin preceded the Mechaber. The Mechaber, the Beis Yosef lived in. Here I have it on page 7. The Beis Yosef lived in 1488. He was born in 1488. These Svarim Did I write down when they were written? Yeah, the Marik was written. Marik was born in 1420, and the Trubas Hadeshin was born in 1390. So both of them, the Marik and the Trubas Hadeshin, preceded the Beis Yosef. One was by 100 years, one was by 50 years. So but nonetheless, the Beis Yosef ignores them, but the Ramah is the champion. He promotes them. So I think that the reason why the Ramah and the Beis Yosef take different positions here is because of what they both write in their Hakdamas. I showed this to you, I think, earlier this year or maybe last year, but I think it's consistent with what they say here. On page 7, the Beis Yosef explains that how does he brings down all sorts of shittas. How do we paskin? How do you decide who to paskin like? On page 7. So the Beis Yosef says on the top of the page, he said, I thought that after I collect all the opinions, I'll decide how the law is. Part of the tachlis of having Shulchan Aruch is there should be one opinion, one final opinion. She says, "V'isi shebanu lomer shachriya din bein poskim b'taynis v'rayis Talmud Sinei atosus chidush Aran v'Rosh v'leim taynis v'rayis l'chachs mihadeya u'mizah sheyarav u'ibo l'gashes l'hosif taynis v'rayis." He says you're going to start. We're not going to be successful in deciding what the halach is because there's so many rayas back and forth, and even in the Rishonim. So he says he says in the next line, he says, we're not smart enough. We're going to be smarter. The Rishonim have a big machokas. We're going to put our heads in the middle of the machokas of Rishonim and try to say, this is the way the halacha goes. So he says in the next paragraph, the three primary poskim of Klal Yisrael are who? Elohim, Arif, Ram, and Rosh. Those were the three giants. Amarti Alibi Shemakom Shishnayim Mem Askim L'Dei Achas Nifsa Halacha Kamosam. So he says, I decided I'm going to go to whichever one has the majority. That's how I'll follow. If you have 2 out of 3, that's going to be. There could only be, it has to be 2 out of 3 because it's an odd number. So there has to be one side is 1 and the other side is 2. So he says, whoever has the majority, that's who he's going to follow. That's the position of the Beis Yosef. The Ramah on the bottom of the page says, he says here, he writes a number of reasons why he wrote the Ramah. So he says, the third reason is, B'tivo el hagdolim nichsaf, the Beis Yosef by his nature wanted to follow the giants. He paskin 2 out of 3. He paskin like 2 out of 3 of the Rif, Ramam, and the Rush. But all the other poskim, the Beis Yosef ignored. He says, even though the Ram and the Rif and the Rush were the early Rishonim, but there were later Rishonim. He's now saying that how come the Beis Yosef, why didn't he follow the Basrai? The Gemara says in a number of places that the halachas is Basrai because the later poskim knew what the earlier poskim said, and nonetheless they had more information. So he says even the Rif himself, the Rif himself says he should pass like the Basrai. Okay. So he says, "V'chein apaska achronim," and that's how the achronim paskin Rosh Marik Umari. That we just saw. He's quoting the he's saying the Marik that we just saw and the Mari. That's the Trubas Hadeshin. They follow the minig of the Basroi. The Beis Yosef, by following 2 out of 3, he destroyed the whole fabric of minhagim because Asher Ruben B'nuyim Ha'Klal Hazeh B'Pshitus Tamimus. Most of the minhagim are based on the fact that this is the opinion of Basroi. And the Beis Yosef says, no, everything follows what the Rif, Ram, and the Rush. But there was all this literature after the Rif, Ram, and the Rush. So the Beis Yosef just ignored it. So so I think with Prusbol, so this is consistent. This Machokas, the Beis Yosef, and the Rush and the Ramah is consistent with these two approaches. The Beis Yosef held you don't follow the Basrai, even though the Gemara says you follow Basrai, you follow the later poskim, but he obviously held that the Rif, the Rush, and the Rambam is an exception. They were such giants. You don't have to see what the later poskim said. These are the three pillars of Hara. That's what we're going to follow. And the Ramah didn't disagree. He says, no, it doesn't matter who they were. You follow the later poskim. And the Ramah, he goes on to say, he has a whole bunch of Sfarim that he quotes extensively in the Shulchan Aruch that the Beis Yosef doesn't quote. The Beis Yosef quotes it in his Parish, but he doesn't quote it in the Shulchan Aruch. So this minhag, so let's put it this way. The Ramah was very minhag oriented. The Ramah constantly writes that the minhag's like this, the minhag's like that, because the Ramah felt that what Klal Yisrael, you can't ignore the way the Klal Yisrael were operating. If there's a minhag, there has to be a basis for the minhag. The minhag was built by, there had to be poskim that felt that should be the minhag, and since they were the minhag was represented the Basroi, this was the final conclusion of the halachic process over the last few hundred years. So he always defers to the minhag. Not always, but generally he defers to the minhag because he holds the minhag represents the Basroi, and therefore he defers to the minhag. And the Beis Yosef, he doesn't care about minhagim. The Beis Yosef, he cares, but the Beis Yosef is not deterred. If the Rambam, the Rush, and the Rif pass in a certain way, that's what he's going to follow. So here, when it comes to Prusbol, the Rambam for sure holds that Shemitah is no bisman hazeh, and the Rif, even though the Ravid says that he's not sure about the Rif, but the Rif quotes the whole sugya, so the Rif seems to also hold that way. And the Rush says that he was upset. He didn't write about it, but he was personally very perturbed. How come they're not being knowing Shemitah? Why aren't they writing Prusbol? So the three Amudi Hara were opposed to it. So even though the Svarim that the Ramah quotes, the Mariel and the Marik and the Trumas Hadeshin, the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo for sure knew about them because they were earlier. They were a generation or two generations before Rav Yosef Karo, but he was consistent with his policy. He's going to follow the three pillars of Hara. But the Ramah, the Ramah says that he's going to follow. He's going to see. There's a vast. There's a whole array of Sfarim that were written by later poskim. The Rif, the Rambam, and the Rush were very early. The Rambam, the Rif was the earliest. The Rif was born in 1013 and he died in 1103. The Rambam was born in 11. I'm not so smart, but I have it written down. 1138 and he died in 1204. And the Rush was born in 1250 and he died in 1327. So the Rif lived in the 11th century. The Rambam lived in the 12th century, and the Rush lived in the 13th century. So they were all, these other Svarim that we're talking about, the Marik and the Mariel and the Trumas Hadeshin, these were all those were already the 15th century. So it's very clear that the Rif, and even though it's a very big chiddush to the extent that the Rush himself said he couldn't understand, but he stopped short. The Rabbanim in Toledo or in Spain told him, you better not make a public statement. You're going to turn the whole world upside down here. This has been the minhag for many years. So he left it, but he personally didn't agree. So so I think that it's a very interesting example of how the Beis Yosef is not swayed. He follows the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush, and the Ramah follows later poskim. And we talked about many times that there were later Sephardic poskim that disagreed with the Beis Yosef, such as the Ben Ish Chai, and they paskind like other Rishonim. They didn't follow necessarily the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush. And then Rav Avad Yosef came and he was Machzer Torah Yoshna. He said in Eretz Yisrael the Beis Yosef was the final posuk, and he was the Mar in the Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he reversed many of the psukim that some of the later Sephardic Gedolim had. He reversed them, and he paskind like the Beis Yosef. So that's the.
So why don't we follow the Ramah? Because you normally do.
Why don't we follow the Ramah? Because the Ramah, the Ramah is not. Because first the Ramah says Kain hu haskamas haposkim. The Ramah says that that's the halacha that you should write prusbol, and then he says over yeshorim that's not. Ramosha has a truth. I can show you next week. Let's say somebody lent money and he wants to go to court to collect it, and he didn't write prusbol. And you forgot to write a prusbol. Does he have a right to go to court? Does he have a right to say, I'm going to go to court because I want to rely on those poskim that the Ramah, do you have a right to rely on those poskim? We'll talk about that next week.
Sure.